Hi, I'm Carol, and I'd like to share a little bit with you today from the scriptures. I know Easter's just passed, but we're returning to those days just before Easter because I think that there's a very relevant point here for us in this time of social isolation and pandemic. So it's the night before Jesus is crucified, and he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. This part of the story is in all four Gospels. You can see I marked them on my Bible to help me today. So we're going to start in Mark, and then we'll jump around depending on who gives us the fullest picture here. So Mark 14, verse 43. Just as he was speaking, and that's Jesus, actually fussing at three of the disciples because they fell asleep while they were supposed to be on watch and he was praying. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. So let's just freeze frame right here and think about the situation that Mark is describing. It's probably about midnight, so it's dark. The Garden of Gethsemane is an olive grove, and olive trees are small trees that are kind of gnarly. If you haven't seen one, think about an apple tree, but if it was really old. It's spring in Israel, and so the olive trees would have had leaves on them, but not any olives yet. I looked it up, and the olive harvest is in October and November. So no olives, but we do have leaves on the trees. There's this crowd of people coming toward Jesus, maybe even 600 men. In John, he describes it as a detachment of soldiers. And technically, a detachment of Roman soldiers was 600 people. So besides the representatives of the chief priests and Pharisees, 600 soldiers coming. And Mark said that they were armed with swords and clubs. John says that they had, I'm going to just read it to you, they were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. So lots in their hands, probably making a lot of noise. And they're coming toward Jesus with Judas in the front, then the representatives from the temple, and then all of these soldiers. Now that's what's happening kind of physically. Emotionally with the disciples, think about the week they've just been through. We call it Passion Week, but they, like, less than a week earlier, they'd watched all of Jerusalem celebrate Jesus's entrance on a donkey and saying Hail and worshiping him. They'd seen him go into Jerusalem every day and go to the temple and debate, even kind of argue with the Pharisees. And then right now they just come off of this beautiful Passover experience with Jesus, but they knew something weird was going on. Jesus washed their feet. Peter didn't want him to wash his feet, remember? And he's like, no, don't wash my feet. But if you wash my feet, wash my whole body, all that stuff. In the middle of dinner, Judas had just skipped out on them and nobody really knew where he went. He still hadn't shown back up till right now. Jesus had talked and talked and talked, and a lot of things that seemed to be really important to him, but were still just so hard for the disciples to understand. Then they walked out to the garden, and Jesus had left some of the disciples in one place. He'd taken Peter, James, and John a little further in. He left them, asked them to keep watch because he knew what was going to happen. And he'd gone on to pray to the Father in this time. You remember, he prayed so hard that he was sweating drops of blood. And every time he came back to the three disciples, they were asleep. I know it's the middle of the night. Still, it's kind of disappointing. They kept falling asleep. And so now, finally, Jesus is like, all right, here they come. Now, this is a real crisis moment. Think about if you're one of these disciples and you've experienced all of this and you're in this place at this time. They came to a crisis point here. And psychologists say when we get like that, that we have this instinct. It's called fight or flight. And we're either going to stand up and fight whatever's confronting us, or we're going to look for a way to get out of it, a way to flee. That's just human nature. That's the way God put us together. It's from Him. But I want to take a little closer look at this today. So the disciples are here, their options are limited, their adrenaline is surging, they see this big crowd coming, and it's a very physical thing for them, but it's also spiritual. Remember in Experiencing God, I don't know if you ever did that study, but Blackaby talks about a crisis of belief. That's a time when what you choose to do next reveals what you really believe about Jesus. And that happens right here for the disciples as well, as they go through this experience. Now, Mark gives us two little mini stories inside the main story here that clearly show us this fight or flight idea. So the first one, it's in Mark, but I want to flip over to Luke to look at this one because I think maybe because he's a doctor, Luke gives us more details about this one. This is in Luke 22:49. When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. So we know this is Peter because John lets it all out of the bag and he tells us Peter's the one who cut off the ear and the name of the servant is Malchus. And we know also that they had two swords because Jesus had actually asked them if they had any swords and told them to bring the swords back when they were in the upper room. And when they were like, well, we have two swords, he said, that's enough. Let's go. So it's not a big surprise that Peter would jump to this conclusion that now was the time to use their swords because Jesus had asked them about the swords. And now here they are with this 600 people. I actually think there may have been this moment with Peter where he does a little bit of mental math in there and he's like, okay, two swords, 600 people. This is the same dude that fed 5,000 people with five loaves of bread and two fish. So, two swords, 600 people. We should be fine here, right? I don't know if maybe he was thinking that clearly, if he thought that, but it came to my mind when I was thinking about it. Peter doesn't wait for Jesus to answer, is not the time to use our swords. He just goes at this guy and chops his ear off right there. His reaction was to fight. When he gets in a situation and everything's tense, he wants to fight. But Jesus says it's not the right thing to do. Jesus goes and heals the guy and puts his ear back on, good as new, and tells him that's enough again. Now, right now, in this time where we are now, facing a pandemic and our social isolation, there are a lot of times that we want to fight. This is a crisis too. It's not that immediate, it kind of happens all in a moment crisis, but we are in a crisis time as a people. And there are ways that we try to fight that. Just a couple of ideas, things I came up with. Some people protest. They refuse to isolate. They refuse to believe the health experts, and they say it's not a big deal. And they even go out in the streets to protest the closing of businesses and things like that. That's a clear way that we fight what's happening. Some people fight it by just going to the extreme on cleaning and being cautious and being even overprotective that they won't go out at all. I had an international friend here, he lives close to me, who went and let his middle schooler go out of the house, not even out into the yard. So that's another way we try to fight what's happening, and we're going to keep ourselves safe no matter what. But there's one other way that I find myself doing, and I call that, because I'm a woman, a superwoman complex. That I'm decided, you know what, I'm going to overcome this. Nothing is going to stop me. I'm going to dominate what's happening here. I'm going to be more successful than I usually am because I have this extra time and because this can't get me down. I'm going to have awesome family times and cook dinner every night. I'm going to be more productive with my work. I'm going to finish long-term projects that have been sitting on the shelf. I am going to accomplish. And really, that's just another way we fight what's happening. Another way to not deal with everything we're going through, and instead just look for a way to make it through. In all these ways, all three of these examples, and you may have other ways that you fight what's happening now, but in all these ways, the focus is on us and what we can do as human beings. It's I'm going to keep myself cleaner. I'm going to refuse to believe, or I'm going to accomplish more. And that's how we fight what's happening here. But now there's another story in Mark, and Mark's the only one who gives us this small little tidbit. I love it, makes me laugh. Lots of things in the scriptures make me laugh, but this one especially. We're back in Mark 14, verse 51. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. That's just funny. Just get that picture in your head. Probably this is John Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, who's also a cousin of Barnabas, who later on, not that much later, a little later on, will go with Paul and Barnabas on that first missionary journey. But then something happens and he leaves, and there's a whole long story with Paul and Mark. But here he's a young man, and for some reason, maybe he left the house in a hurry. I don't know. Some reason he came out with only this one linen tunic on. And when things started getting crazy, he was so anxious to get away that when somebody grabbed him, he just kind of slipped out of his shirt and ran off naked down the road. Now I'm hoping he wasn't really that old. Maybe he's just like 12 or something. I don't know. But can you imagine the look on the face of the guard who grabbed him? He grabbed onto his shirt and suddenly he's just holding a shirt. And the guy is gone down the road. But Mark wasn't the only one who fled, was he? Everybody fled. I think this may be the saddest verse in this whole story. It's just before that. It says, "Then everyone deserted him and fled." Everyone left Jesus there in front of those 600 soldiers by himself. They didn't have to do that. They didn't need to flee. Jesus actually asked the soldiers and the representatives from the temple not to arrest anyone else. John tells us about that. And they weren't trying to arrest anyone else. And yet everyone was so afraid. Their instinct kicked in and they ran away. Now, there are a lot of ways that we try to flee the crisis that's happening now in our world. One of those ways, one of my personal preferences, is reading. There was a week, I didn't bring them with me, but there was this one week, 7 days, and I read 6 books. It was about this tall. I was reading a book every 24 hours. That was probably not so healthy. Maybe I needed it in that moment, but that probably wasn't the best way to manage the stress in my life right then. Some people go to sleeping a whole lot. Sometimes it's cooking. It's if you're using that thing to not think about what's happening in our world. A lot of people turn to entertainment and binging Netflix shows or watching a movie series over, and none of those things are wrong in themselves. And like I said before, God gave us this instinct of fight or flight, but it's when we take them to the extreme and we use them to avoid what's happening in our lives. That's when it turns into something that the Lord needs to challenge us on. So anything we do just to not have to think about the virus and about the pandemic and about social isolation and about the number of people who've died, that stuff gets me down, y'all. I cry more days than not about what's happening in our world. And sometimes we do, we just need to get away, but sometimes we need to make a different choice. So that's the 2 ideas that psychologists give us. That's the 2 that we know about. We can fight like Peter did, or we can flee like Mark did. But friends, we're not just human. We're not governed by instinct. We are inhabited as Christians by the Holy Spirit. I propose to you that there's a third option beyond fight or flight. I suggest to you that we can also follow what's happening in front of us. And in this story in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is the only person who chooses this other option, who reacts in a third way, and he follows God's will for him in this time. Now he didn't have to. That's one of the beautiful things here. Remember, they came at him with swords and clubs and lanterns and weapons, but Jesus had been healing people and raising the dead for 3 years. I don't think those weapons could do anything to him. He could have healed himself. He didn't need to be afraid about the weapons that they brought with him. And they brought this big crowd of people with him. But that couldn't stop Jesus. You remember early on in his ministry, the people of Nazareth, his hometown, wanted to stone him. And they took him out, or not stone him. They took him out to the edge of a cliff, and they were going to throw him over the cliff. Later, in the temple, they tried to stone him. I was thinking about that earlier. But this time, they take him out to a cliff, and they're going to throw him over the cliff outside Jerusalem. And what does he do? He just walks back through the crowd like they're not even there. And the scriptures say he went on his way, just went on his way. So there was nothing that crowd could do to actually stop Jesus. In fact, he even acknowledges it to Peter. It's in the Matthew version, and he tells Peter to put his sword back in place. And then he says, "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" Jesus knew he had to go through this. It had to happen in this way. And just a little interesting fact, in case you like the numbers like I do, I told you that it was a detachment of soldiers, so probably 600 soldiers who came out to get Jesus that night. A Roman legion, is 6,000 soldiers, 6,000, this time it's angels, 6,000 people in there. And then Jesus says it's 12 legions. So 12 times 6,000 to go against these 600 Roman soldiers. Nothing was keeping Jesus in this place. In fact, I think that they could have sent one man. One person could have walked out to the Garden of Gethsemane, not even armed with a club or a sword or anything, could have walked up to Jesus and said, "It's time to go." And Jesus would have gone with him. I think that's how much Jesus knew he needed to follow God's will in this moment. Now, what does it mean for us to follow in this time of crisis? Couple of things. I'd love it if you, in the comments, if you give me some answers what you think it means to follow what God's leading us toward in this time. One thing might be that you have to lean into the suffering of another person. You may get a phone call and you're like, "I really can't deal with this right now." But God wants you to stay there with that person and hear what's happening in their lives and walk through it with them. Another thing might be that you need to just stop and seek the Lord's face in prayer when that crisis really comes up in front of you. You may need to step back and look for what He wants you to learn in this time. That's one thing I've been trying to ask. What are you trying to show me, Lord? What do you want me to learn through what's happening here? You know, everything that God sends us through, He does it first for His glory and second for our good. And so how can I glorify God through this? I can ask Him, what action can I take right now that's best going to glorify you, Lord? What can I do that's going to glorify you? And then what can I learn from this that's going to help me grow as a believer? We can always be asking that question, especially in these difficult days. And then sometimes we just need to accept the difficulty of a moment. We need to go through that grief or that loneliness or whatever it is that just washes over us. We need to just face it and walk through it. None of us are going to do this perfectly. Y'all, I have moments of flight and fight and follow every single day. From moment to moment, things change. And know that there are times when God leads us to flee, times when He leads us to fight, and times when He leads us to kind of sit back and just let it go through it with Him. As I was preparing for this, even I was reading in Acts, and I just want to show you. I don't have this one marked. I'll show you how Paul is a fantastic example of this. And you may remember that early on in his ministry, he escaped out of Damascus in a basket out a window in the wall in the middle of the night. I mean, if that's not fleeing, what is, right? A laundry basket in the middle of the night. But then other times he stood up even to Roman proconsuls and important people in the government, and he fought for his faith and for what Jesus was doing in a place. So he was doing both of those. And here they are, both in the same little section. He's in Iconium, and it's in the first missionary journey. So he's with Barnabas. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There, they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their mind against the brothers. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there, speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. So they fought, they stayed, and they spoke to the people, and they spoke boldly, and they did miracles, and they showed that what they were saying was really true. Okay, but then, verse 5, there was a plot afoot among both Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat Paul and Barnabas and stone them. But Paul and Barnabas found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the gospel. So things got to the point where they had to run, so they stayed and fought, but also they fled. But both of those things were part of what God had for them. That was a way of following in that moment. And there are times when we just have to do that. So sometimes God leads us to fight, sometimes he leads us to flee. But friends, just don't forget that there's another option. Sometimes he leads us to let it happen, to be completely present in the moment. And when God calls us to follow, to step into that crisis and walk through it, y'all know that we're not alone. We're following him. Remember, we're following him, which means he is with us. He's right there in front of us. In Psalm 23, it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. In the valley of the shadow of death. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the fiery furnace, God didn't save them out of the furnace. He didn't prevent them from getting into the furnace. But when they were in there, the pre-incarnate Jesus walked in the fire with them through their crisis. When Mary and Martha were grieving over the loss of Lazarus, and Jesus waited 3 days to come and raise him from the dead, which they didn't even know he was going to do anyway, he didn't immediately do that the moment he got there. He went through the grief with them there on the road outside Bethany. And he, even to the point that he cried with them. Jesus wept in grief with these sisters. He joins us in our suffering. He joins us through our crisis. So tomorrow or the next day, there's going to be this moment when this thing, this pandemic and the social isolation and all that, when it looms right up in your face and your adrenaline starts to rise and you've got to make a choice, just remember, don't forget, there's a third option. You can follow him through the situation. So thank you for listening to this.